After the Australian Grand Prix, what really started to generate conversation within the paddock was not Ferrari's final result, nor even Lewis Hamilton's track position. What really caught my attention was the data. Because when the engineers began to analyze the long runs that the Briton had done in Albert Park, a pattern appeared that is not usually seen so early when a driver changes teams. Hamilton was lapping with extremely high consistency, maintaining very stable lap times over several consecutive laps, and most importantly, with much more controlled tire degradation than many expected in a Ferrari. Subscribe to continue uploading more of this type of content now, if we continue. To understand why this is so important, you have to understand something fundamental about modern Formula One. In training, teams are not only looking for a fast lap to appear on the timetable. In reality, much of the work consists of analyzing how the car behaves during long runs, simulating racing conditions with heavier fuel tanks and with tires that begin to degrade. It is in that context that engineers can really see the potential of a car and the level of control the driver has over it. And that was precisely where Hamilton's numbers began to surprise. The records showed that lap after lap, the Briton was able to maintain a very consistent pace without major peaks in performance loss, something that suggests that the SF26 has a fairly solid aerodynamic base, and above all, a much wider tire operating window than Ferrari had the previous season. This kind of consistency not only speaks volumes about the car, it also says a lot about the driver. When a driver still does not fully understand car, the telemetry usually shows small constant corrections in fast corners, slight losses of stability, or variations in pace that appear when the tires begin to degrade. But in the case of Hamilton in Australia, the data showed something different. Its lines were clean, the corrections were minimal, and the car remained stable even when the track began to demand more aerodynamic balance. It's exactly the kind of pattern that analysts like Nico Rosberg often point to when talking about a driver who has already found a way to adapt to a new car. And that is where the most interesting element of this entire analysis appears. Rosberg has long explained that with today's cars, and especially new aerodynamic philosophies, there are three factors that determine whether a driver can extract maximum performance from a car: the energy efficiency of the car, the stability in fast corners, and the driver's ability to use that performance without destroying the tires too soon. In the case of the Ferrari in Australia, Hamilton's data seemed to fit those three parameters surprisingly well. His pace was consistent, the car looked stable in the fast sections of the Albert Park circuit, and tire degradation was under control during the long stints. This doesn't mean that Ferrari is dominating the season, or that Hamilton already has the perfect car. In fact, the data itself also shows that there is still a difference with some rivals in certain aspects of performance. But what really caught the attention within the paddock is that this type of telemetry normally appears much later in the season, when driver and car have had time to evolve together. That these patterns appear already in the first race is what has sparked so many conversations between engineers, analysts, and commentators. Because if Hamilton has managed to understand the behavior of the Ferrari so early, the margin of evolution that the project may have throughout the year could be much greater than what many expected at the beginning of the season. And this brings us to the next big mystery that began to circulate after Australia. When the telemetries of Hamilton and Charles Leclerc start to be compared in more detail, how big will the difference really be between the two drivers? Because if the Briton has already found an efficient way to exploit the SF26 after just one race, then the internal duel at Ferrari could become much more interesting than many imagined. And that is precisely the part of the analysis that begins to reveal why some experts, including Rosberg, have been truly surprised by the numbers that Hamilton left in Albert Park. As they began to further analyze the data from the Australian Grand Prix, attention soon turned to an inevitable comparison within Ferrari, the telemetry between Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. And this comparison is precisely what can explain why analysts like Nico Rosberg have shown so much curiosity with the numbers that Hamilton left in Albert Park. Because Ferrari not only now has one of the most experienced drivers in the history of Formula One, it also has a driver who has been understanding the behavior of the Maranello car for years. And when you put both data side by side, the analysis begins to reveal very interesting things. Over the Australian weekend, it was seen that Hamilton had begun to adapt his driving style to be closer to the way Leclerc usually extracts performance from the Ferrari. In particular, the Briton began to use a technique that the Monegasque has been applying for years, releasing the accelerator before the corner and applying the brakes more progressively to maintain a higher minimum speed when cornering. This change may seem small, but in a car with an aero window as delicate as modern Ferraris, it can make a huge difference in stability and performance. In fact, in qualifying, Hamilton was just a few tenths behind Leclerc's pace, something quite remarkable considering that he was still in the process of adapting to the car. This detail is key to understanding why data analysis became so interesting after the race. Normally, when a driver changes teams, he needs several races, sometimes even half a season, to fully adjust his driving style to the behavior of the car. However, in Australia, it could already be seen that Hamilton was beginning to modify his way of attacking corners to adapt to the Ferrari, something that even he himself acknowledged by admitting that he was still learning what changes were possible and what were not during a race weekend. But what has really piqued the curiosity of analysts like Rosberg is not just the lap time. It is the pattern that appears when studying several consecutive turns. Because while Leclerc remains one of Ferrari's fastest single-lap drivers, the kind of consistency Hamilton showed over long runs suggests the Briton could have a very interesting strategic advantage in race conditions. Maintaining a consistent pace without destroying tires is one of the most valuable skills in today's Formula One, especially on circuits where degradation can completely change the outcome of a race. And that's exactly what was seen in the SF26 records in Melbourne. However, this also opens up a question that could become one of the big themes of the season within Ferrari. If Hamilton continues to close the gap on Leclerc race after race, what will happen when both drivers are fully adapted to the SF26? Because Ferrari could find itself with a very interesting situation. Two drivers capable of fighting at the same level within the same team, but with different driving styles and possibly different strengths depending on the type of circuit. And if that internal rivalry begins to intensify, the data analysis that surprises Rosberg today could become something much more important. It could be the first clue that Ferrari has not only signed a world champion, but has found a driver capable of transforming the way the team understands its own car. After analyzing all the data left by the Australian Grand Prix, the conclusion that is beginning to take shape within the paddock is that the most important thing may not be the result of the first race, but what those numbers could mean for Ferrari's immediate future. Because if engineers have learned anything over the years in Formula One, it is that telemetry rarely lies. And when the data starts to show consistency, stability, and control of the car so early in a season, it is usually a sign that there is a much more solid technical and human foundation than what is perceived from the outside. In the case of Hamilton and the SF26, what appeared in Australia suggests exactly that. A driver who is beginning to understand how to exploit the car, and a car that seems to offer a much more stable platform than its predecessor. This point is especially relevant because Ferrari has been seeking precisely that stability for years. In many previous seasons, the Italian team has had cars that were very fast on one lap, but suffered when trying to maintain a constant pace for a full race. Degradation problems, operating windows that were too narrow, or difficulties in maintaining aerodynamic balance had often limited the team's potential. However, data that began to circulate after Melbourne indicated that the SF26 could have corrected some of those problems, offering more predictable behavior on long runs and much more controlled tire management. And this is where Hamilton's role could become even more important than many imagined when his arrival at Ferrari was announced. Beyond pure speed, one of the 7-time world champion's greatest assets has always been his ability to work with the engineers and help develop the car throughout the season. If from a first race it is already producing consistent and clear data on how the car performs in racing conditions, that means that Ferrari could have a very solid foundation to evolve the car in the next races. In Formula One, understanding the behavior of the car is the first step to improving it, and the sooner that understanding is achieved, the greater the scope for development during the year. That is why it is not surprising that analysts like Nico Rosberg have shown so much curiosity about the numbers that Hamilton left in Australia. Rosberg knows perfectly well that the first races of a season often reveal patterns that are then repeated throughout the year. And when a driver shows clean telemetry from the start, with stable lines and a consistent pace, it usually means that adaptation to the car is happening much faster than the rest of the paddock expected. However, the true impact of this data will only be seen in the upcoming races. Because if Hamilton continues to improve his adaptation to the Ferrari, and the team manages to take advantage of that technical base that the SF26 seems to have shown in Australia, the Ferrari project could transform into something much more competitive than many analysts had anticipated before the season began. And if that happens, the Australian Grand Prix could go down in history as more than just the first race of the year. It could be the moment when the first signs began to appear that the alliance between Hamilton and Ferrari had the potential to change the balance of forces within Formula One. After everything we saw at the Australian Grand Prix, there is an idea that is beginning to gain strength within the paddock. Perhaps the true impact of Lewis Hamilton's debut with Ferrari is not in the result of that first race, but in what the data he left on the track revealed. Because when the engineers analyzed the long runs, the constant pace, and the way the Briton was managing the SF-26, what they found was exactly the kind of telemetry that normally appears when a driver has already begun to deeply understand how his car works. And that is precisely what has caught the attention of analysts like Nico Rosberg. The really interesting thing is that all this happened in the first race of the season. Adapting to a new team in Formula One is usually a long process, especially when we talk about Ferrari, a team with very different technical philosophies than those Hamilton previously knew. However, data from Australia show clear signs that adaptation could be happening much faster than expected. Consistency over long runs, the car's stability in fast corners, and control of tire degradation are indicators that normally reveal when a driver has begun to master his car, and these patterns were already present at Albert Park. Subscribe to continue uploading more of that content. Now you really think about all this.